Agnes, burst blood vessels. Deborah, in child bed. Lawrence, been long bad with leprosy. Seditha, a smallpox. Violet, child, fever and worms. Hamlet, of a nervous fever. Fortuna, she has been useless 2 years past.
These are just some of the names of the nearly 300 slaves who died on the Roselle sugar plantation in Jamaica between 1769 and 1811.
Letitia,
2 families would own that land for over 100 years. The Fergusons and the Hunter Blairs from Ayrshire in Scotland.
Belinda,
And we are joined today by Alex Renton, a campaigning journalist and broadcaster, but also one of their descendants, to try to understand how apparently intelligent, cultured, kind and enlightened people could enthusiastically trade in, own and brutalise fellow human beings. You're listening to Trapped History.
William Brown, pleurisy and sore throat. Rodney, pleurisy and sore throat. Queen, pleurisy and sore throat. Lucky, pleurisy and sore throat. Mulatto David, pleurisy and sore throat.
Alex, you're a writer and a historian who doesn't shy away from the difficult stories, so welcome to Trapped History.
Thank you so much.
Nice to have you here. You've tackled our food and our meat industry in Planet Carnivore and 13 Foods That Shape Our World, public schools and paedophilia in Stiff Upper Lip and your 2 series of the BBC podcast In Dark Corners, and of course your own family's history of slave ownership in Blood Legacy. Do you ever feel like writing about flowers or the joy of disco?
Well, interesting you say that. My wife and my children are going, can you do something with jokes in it next time? Which is a fair ask.
And what would jokes look like for you?
Well, I don't know. I've been spending quite a lot of time in southern Spain, actually. I'm really interested in sherry and the trade history of sherry and the taste of sherry. So I don't know. The publishing world's not in great nick at the moment.
I mean, seriously, though, we had the historian Kim Wagner on a few seasons ago when he was talking about massacres. In particular, the episode was about the Bardayo massacre in the Philippines in 1906, and 55 years later, the October massacre on the streets of Paris in 1961. If you've not caught it yet, the episode really is essential listening. Search for Making Sense of Murder on Apple, Spotify, or find it on trappedhistory.com. Anyway, Kim rather specializes in researching and writing about these colonial massacres, Amritsar, Bardayo, My Lai at the moment. And one of the things we talked about was what facing that horror day in, day out does to him, what it can do to anyone. I mean, how do you stay sane?
It's so interesting you mentioned that, because I listened to that Kim Wagner, and I wrote down a quote. He said there is a solace in looking at the atrocities of the past, a way of avoiding the horror of present events and retaining the conceit that I am doing something important and relevant. I mean, he was very self-disparaging, but I kind of know what that is. I mean, I think, I think I have a heightened, perhaps, anger about cruelty and the vulnerability in tiny areas in the world, where as a journalist you can do something to get redress or tell the true story. That is a solace. I mean it's a privilege to be able to, because it does, like Kim said, is a way of avoiding the problems that beset us immediately. We all have them that we can't do anything about.
Now today, Alex, we're focusing on your book, Blood Legacy. It's a tale of your own family. We're talking great-grandfathers times 6, way back 200, 250 years, but about their involvement in slavery. And we've talked quite a bit about slavery over the years on Trapped History in the broadest sense. But today's a chance to take a deep dive into it from one slave-owning family's perspective. We're going granular. And we just want to be clear about what we're doing today and about what we're not doing. Firstly, we're not telling the stories of the enslaved. That's something for another day. It's hugely important, the most important, but it's not something we're equipped to do justice to today. And secondly, by telling Alex's family story, we're not putting the stories of the enslavers above the stories of the enslaved. We're not here to draw attention away from the people that all of this happened to. And thirdly, we're not in a business of white self-pity. This isn't an exercise in self-flagellation, making this quote unquote all about me.
What this is about is very simple. Again, three things. Firstly, and this is the history bit, how and why could people do this? How could your ancestors, Alex, how could they do this? Secondly, how do you, Alex, how do you today face up to an extremely unpalatable, shameful family history? And thirdly, I think it's about accountability. Again, as Carla said, it's not about guilt or some sort of narcissistic self-importance, but it's also not about trying to wish it away, to whitewash it away. It's about being able to look this in the eye and say, yeah, we did that. The other thing for me is the we is a really important part of this. For starters, I don't think we can get away with saying, oh, it's them, it's royalty, it's aristocracy. You know, we're all in this together. Hundreds of thousands of white British people directly owned or traded in enslaved people over the course of 300 years. And millions of white British people benefited from that indirectly. Also, and I think this is one of the aspects of any contemporary discussion of slavery today, which is still a hugely live debate, again, about who we mean when we're saying we. You'll get some people saying, well, we didn't do this. This happened 300 years ago, get over it. And you then will have other people saying, no one's ever apologized to us. This is still happening to us now. So, Alex, I mean, when you're looking at this issue of accountability, does it matter who we mean when we're talking about we?
You're absolutely right that it's wrong for people to say the most visible slave owners are the ones that need to deal with, or their descendants, the ones with the big houses or whatever, or famous names, because it was, as many historians have now agree, right at the core of what was going on economically in the 19th century, and everybody in gun making to catching fish off the west coast of Scotland was benefiting from the fact of those Caribbean markets. I know from my family's accounts, their archive, that almost every piece of protein that was eaten by the enslaved people on the two plantations was shipped from the west of Scotland: beef or salted herrings. So the whole of Britain that was here then benefited, and arguably, there's a stat around saying that Britain was able to borrow the money that financed the wars against Napoleon, a foundational episode, because we could borrow money cheaply on the international markets because of the guaranteed inflow and tax income from the sugar estates. So there's no way of disentangling it from the absolute core of our history, though there are those who would want to. But we, in terms of responsibility, I mean, I think that what has come up a lot in these discussions since I wrote the book is guilt. And I talk to a lot of people who have histories like mine and my family's, and I, as you say, I can't feel guilt for something I had no say in. Nobody consulted me that we were going to enslave and murder Africans for profit. But you can feel shame, because my family feels very proud about the grand members of parliament and generals and lawyers that make up our history. So if you can feel proud about them, you can feel shame about the things they did wrong. And you also, and I think this comes to me, is I feel shame that I spent all my life saying I'm anti-racist. I believe we committed great crimes as a colonial power, and we should put them right, and doing absolute bugger all about it. Particularly about the stuff on my doorstep, which is the systemic disadvantages based on race that black people face in Britain today, in education and criminal justice and healthcare. That's shame. So it's big. What you do is big and punchy. Yeah.
think it's also really important to bring MK into this, because I'm acutely aware we can easily fall into the trap of, white people talking about slavery. And there are 3 white people and 1 black person sitting around this table. MK, you have South African rather than Caribbean heritage, but where's your head at in any discussion like this?
I think the first thing to me is I can't be the black perspective, because obviously black people are not a monolith in any way. But I do feel when I see other black people, I feel some sort of kinship with them. I don't know whether that's sort of a bond formed by trauma sometimes, because obviously the black experience that I've had in South African compared to the Caribbean experience is very different. But I do feel some sort of, I think in South Africa with apartheid we had the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation, how do you say it? Reconciliation Commission, and that was you mentioned before about reckoning, that word reckoning. I think that was some sort of reckoning where the people who were responsible for a lot of what happened in apartheid kind of sat down and spoke about the realities of what happened. And I think there's a feeling within the Caribbean community I see in this country specifically, is that hasn't really been afforded here. The establishment hasn't really sat down and spoke with that community about the truth about it, and where we're at with it. And I think there's a frustration there, and it would be good to have that conversation at the very least, I think.
This is an open wound that's been open since the end of the abolition in 1830, nearly 200 years. But I mean, it's clearly there are models for peoples who have been at terrible, murderous disagreement with each other, or desperately exploited, to come forward and move forward. The German nation and the Israelis, or the Jews arrived at a form of peace after the war, and that is only done by talking and open-mindedness. At the moment, even today, the British government is, we will not talk about reparative justice with the Caribbean nations. Literally, we won't even sit down 14 years after they first asked, and a huge amount of British society will not yet agree that this was an absolute evil based on racism.
Do you think that was? Do you think it was because the slavery was offshored to the Caribbean? It wasn't around. So, say for example, in America, slaves would be present, picking cotton, etc. Whereas I feel like,
I think that's really important. If it had happened in Wiltshire or Perthshire, it would be more in our faces. But then equally, the descendants of the enslaved arrived here on the Windrush and afterwards, and look how we've reacted to them since. So, but I mean, I talked to lots of people in this area, both descendants of the enslavers and people in the reparations area in the States, and it is a more mature conversation there. I mean, most universities, have addressed it in one way or another. I mean, cities are now doing it. Chicago has a reparations, particularly looking at Jim Crow and abuses that happened after slavery in the States. But we're way behind, and I think we're other European nations who are, we're not the only enslaving European nation. I mean, though we're the second most in terms of quantities. Portugal beats us. Holland's been having a more healthy conversation. I'd say it's well overdue, and certainly the people of the Caribbean community I talk to, are fed up with being told, get over it. You've been bloody lucky. You were lucky to be enslaved by us, which is kind of the dialogue.
That's a lot of it, isn't it? I mean, similar type of thing when they speak about India. We built railways, and that kind of thing is said a lot, and it's
I mean. I have a line which I always quote, because literally the morning my book was published in 2021, and Satnam Sanghera, you guys all know, interviewed me at great length, brilliantly, really kindly, in the Times, which was wonderful. My publisher was very pleased, and I'd seen it, saw it, read it, and it looked okay. And then I went online to see how it looked online, and looked at the first of 500 comments, and I cannot believe how naive I was. I thought they'd be about 50-50. But they were entirely negative and really aggressive, and a lot disappeared later in the day when the moderator got out of bed. There was a problem. But the top one with 75 likes or whatever by 8 a.m. what we gave them paradise islands. What more do they want? And you did, and I said to him, this is middle educated people like me, middle English. This is, and it's not just the denial of the history and the actual, the mass murder and the 250 years and the extent of it, but it's something sort of more worrying and more corrosive, which is this sort of this assumption that of justice, and that the fact that eventually we abolished it atones for everything. And I find that really disturbing. It's this endless excusing from the white middle class, where it looks, let's say, it was like a slightly unfair labour practice, like your hours too long and you only got a holiday on once a year. It's like working, people worked down the coal mines in 19th century Britain, and they were essentially slaves. This is industrialized. It's done by Christian people, and it's racist. It's entirely racist. By the time my ancestors were doing it, you could not enslave a white person. So they justified what they did, which is treating people like animals, literally like animals, in the worst possible way, on the grounds that Africans weren't human beings. And that legacy still is in the air.
Picking up on everything you've said, I don't feel that as a white British person that I and other white British people like me would even think that slavery is part of our past, this part of our family history, even our family histories. Whereas a black person with Caribbean heritage, it's there. It is, literally in some cases branded into the DNA.
There's no person of African origin in the Caribbean who wasn't enslaved by the European nations. Literally none. And, unless they migrated post 1830, which is pretty rare.
Do you know if you have any relatives yourselves that would be?
Yeah, I do. I have some relatives. I've done DNA tests and I have some relatives in St Elizabeth Parish, but it's through my father's family, who were also one ancestor of whom was his mother was. So I have a West African enslaved woman in my DNA. She's my 6 times grandmother. And the book is dedicated to.
And were you always aware of this from when you were young?
It's so awful, isn't it? It's just absolutely. So I'm 65. I was 55 when I found out, and I was literally rainy day in my grandparents' house. I was down in the basement looking at the papers that he catalogued, and I was going, "Why does it say Jamaica and Tobago all the time?" These were the letters from the 18th century.
So it wasn't discussed.
No. So I found out my mum did know because it was discussed in their generation, but her generation hadn't decided to tell any of us, and we were quite shocked. You'd think you'd say, wouldn't you? Because I was going. Because I knew they'd been rich, and I knew they'd been like governor generals of India and so on, but unless you're corrupt, isn't necessarily a well-paying job, and they've been in the army and all this, and they've been members of parliament. But I imagine that the money came from, because they owned land in Scotland, from farmed land that they rented out to farmers. It was a bit innocent, wasn't it? But my father said, he did tell me, but he said, don't worry about it. We didn't do it for very long. We didn't make much money, and everyone else was doing it. Meaning all the neighbours, landed gentry. And I went, how could you not have told me about this? And she went, yeah, maybe I should have done. And so my mum and I then spent the next year, I was photographing the papers and transcribing them, and we just getting them into order. So now anyone listening, if you want that transcription, I'll send it to you, because why should I have it? And learning what the story was, and it. I remember sitting down there, in that room with a table lamp and an iPad, a tablet, photographing pages, and they're far too hard to read. You can't get them automatically transcribed. You've got to do it by hand. You've got to read them 3 times. It's hard, and you'd suddenly stumble upon something that literally made you feel sick. I remember the first time I saw the prices on the children. It still makes me want to cry today. it just, you went, it was like it was like you being hit in the stomach. And it was an amazing journey. But I mean, what a privilege. I mean, having access to that material, it's amazing. You're a lucky man. And I kind of had to write the book because even if no one, people don't care what my views on it all, but the story needs to be out there because we stole the history as well. We didn't, one of the people in the Caribbean nations and and the diaspora don't have access to the history of what happened to their ancestors. Very hard to get access. So that's a kind of moral duty as well.
You've talked about your own family in the earlier generations and sort of not sharing the story of being an enslaving family. I mean, how do you square your feelings and what you've been doing and trying to tell this story with the rest of your family today? I mean, are they all behind this? Are they saying no, we don't want to go anywhere near that? Are they saying, well, weren't doing it for very long, didn't make any money from it, and everyone else was doing it, so move on, move on?
No, not all my family subscribe with it. I mean, and I think I was quite naive about. I mean, I kind of sort of, I told them what I was doing. I mean, I was in their house, in my cousin's house. He lives there down in the basement. Told him what I was finding. But I think some of them, I mean, the great majority are with me and it, and think it's right to get it out and acknowledge and admit it's the right thing to do. And some of them have joined me in giving token amounts of money to various sort of charities and educational things for people in the Caribbean and here, black people here. And but no, 2 or 3 where I'm afraid we won't talk again. I don't think, because they felt I mean, it was a good illustration of what's been going on in Britain really since in the culture wars and so on. And the book, when they read the draft, it was just literally the weekend that the Colston statue was tipped into the water in Bristol, and so there was some suggestion I was putting them at risk, making them targets of angry black people, I suppose, and that hasn't transpired, obviously enough, and or in any way at all actually, but and then also I think a deeper sense that I kind of undermined their sense of who they were. We are an ancestor worshipping nation. Well, those who are rich enough to know who their ancestors are, or who, and I think I'd undermined the fact that they, I think, like me, we thought I came from a long line of empire builders who were essentially good people, and that was no longer true. So some of them took that really badly. It's a very contested area, and I very naively went into it, not kind of thinking everyone would go, "Oh, you've done a really good job."
In April 1773, James Ferguson, your 6 times great uncle, sails across the Atlantic from Scotland to Tobago. He's looking for an investment, a business deal for the family. Can you fill us in, please, Alex, on what he found and what he did?
So he's a youngest son at a time of really a gold rush because a whole load of new land had opened up after a truce with the French. They'd given some islands to the British, basically, and he was sent by his older family, who are entrepreneurial, basically going, we've got to get in there. All our neighbours are doing it, and which is true. And he arrived in Grenada and started casting around, talking to lawyers and people who were selling plots of land, and eventually settled on Tobago, where a Glaswegian he met, Mr. Wilson, had in a government auction had bought a 300 square lump of land, and he went over to Tobago, decided that talked to locals. There was another Ferguson, different family already on the island, looked after him, and this is raw jungle. decided it should be cotton and indigo. It's not suitable for sugar. And he went to the market in Scarborough and Tobago and bought 7 people he described as Igbos, which is a West African tribe, who to this is his initial purchase, borrowed money to do it, wrote back to his brothers, and set sail in a little boat round the island to land on the beach, and alongside them start clearing the raw jungle. So it's kind of an amazing scene. I mean, the remotest edge of this small island in the remote, right down in the southern end of the Eastern Caribbean, and there are other plantations, but they're 10, 15 miles away, and there are also slave rebellions on the other plantations, in those times. But anyway, he's there, 26-year-old man, rolling up his sleeves, hacking down, and he writes these sort of letters back to his older brothers, the bank rollers, going, I'm working really hard. The Africans like working with me. We get along with each other. That's great. I dress their wounds. I put a few pills and so on. And he says more than once that he believes in treating them well makes moral sense and economic sense. Obviously, but unlike other. Because other white planters tell him you've got to be brutal with them, and you've got to be, whip them and so on. He thinks that's wrong. But then in that same letter, in which his Christian brothers must have applauded, showing humanity and so on, he says there's a little weird squiggle in the margins, and I worked out that this was a design interlinking his initials with his brothers' initials, JF, AF, and CF, James, Adam, and Charles Ferguson, and he says, if you approve this design, I will send to Barbados to have it made in silver, and then I will mark them. And obviously, these guys he's working alongside, he wants to press a hot silver branding iron with his initials into their chests, and he realizes that is what's going on. Just as later in the story, they deliberately import teenage women from West Africa because the price of slaves is going up and you've got to breed more. The Africans can be treated in a way that no white person can be treated, and that's morally okay, because David Hume, the philosopher, has said so. And this is where the gap between everyone who goes, slavery's everywhere, the Arab slaves people, the Russian slave people, but it wasn't racist, it wasn't racially based, skin color based.
There's something he writes in, I think, 1775 about building the Carrick plantation.
I have got very little cotton planted yet, owing to the extreme wetness of the season, and most of the slaves not being thoroughly seasoned. I dare not work them much in such weather, both for the sake of humanity and interest, as the life of a slave or two would be considerable deduction from the profits of our crop.
What does he mean by seasoned?
Seasoning is there was so essentially Africans came on the ships, sold on the West African shore, herded onto ships, and then if they survived and 20% died on the voyage, they would arrive in the markets and then be bought and taken onto plantations. But often it was decided that the slave marketers would take them to a seasoning camp where they would break their spirit, as you might break a horse's spirit to ride it, and this would involve torture and savagery, and essentially reducing. There are different accounts of how it actually worked, reducing someone to a state of such terror and docility that they're no longer a threat or a liable runaway. And there's another aspect to it which, beside that horror, which I find particularly really moving, is that their names are removed, so they're dehumanized. So the list of names of plantations, and I have them for you've read them out. They're all joke names. They're like Hannibal or Hercules or Othello or Juliet. So they're from Shakespeare, or they're sometimes family names. I mean, a lot of the traditional Christian names appear. It's horrific to think about. And I think this is a process of removing people's humanity. you take away their birth names and give them the names you would give to your pet horse or your pet dog. So that's seasoning. I mean, an element of it also, I think, will be getting some resistance to the diseases in the Caribbean, which would be very different climate from West Africa. And we have to remember that the average life of an adult male enslaved person in that period is 3 to 4 years, because it's cheaper to work them to death than buy a new one, even though, as he says, it's an economic liability. So there's very few babies born. It's cheaper to destroy the person and get another.
In that quote from James's letter, he says that he dare not work them for the sake of humanity.
Yes, interesting.
Do you see much humanity?
Well, that word, there's 2 or 3 letters where that occurs. It's really weird as his descendants, because I felt a bit of a bond with him. I kind of, when he wrote I felt, his fear and his wife. He's angry and he's lonely. He doesn't hear from his brothers for a year because letters go missing. And he's borrowed lots of money. They put all this trust in him. And he doesn't feel an alien. And so when I see the sort of humanity things, or talking about bandaging their wounds and how they trust him, I go, I'd reach for those as I was transcribing the letters, because there are moments when you go, you're going to do the decent thing. But no, I mean, it remains the only explanation is this absurd judgment that he was able to believe he wasn't dealing with other human beings, because the Scottish philosophers had said that 20 years ago, so this made it okay.
The Scottish connection is a fascinating and sobering one. Tobago today is full of Scottish place names. There's a Glencoe, a Culloden, a Speyside, and it's also full of Scottish surnames as well: Campbell, Stewart, Ferguson, your own family forebears, Alex. And overall, from 1750 until slavery's abolition, 34,000 Scots made the journey to the Caribbean. And they wouldn't all have been slave owners. There were plenty of other jobs running the plantations and the associated trades. And the poet Robbie Burns might have been in their number too, aiming to emigrate in 1785 as a plantation overseer, but he famously and literally missed the boat. So when slavery was abolished in the Caribbean, and this is jumping forward to the 1830s, records show that per head of population, far more Scots were involved in slave ownership than people from the other nations of Great Britain. In fact, 20% of compensation claims were from Scots.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the other indicator we have now, of course, is DNA, where I think, almost everybody in the Caribbean who identifies as black has white DNA, and often Scots DNA in them, because the rape was licensed, and indeed financially rewarded, because a baby with white blood in it fetched more money and was seen as more fit to work in the house than in the fields. And yeah, so the Scots, 34,000, I think it's Stephen Mullen's figure, and a lot. So my ancestors were often sending the sons of tenants, farmers, out, obviously with their agreement, as indentured labour. So they'd be paid, their families would be paid a sum up front, and they'd go and work for a number of years, and they'd be bookkeepers on the estate. It's an awful lot of bookkeeping. It's like Hannah Arendt, right? There's a banality of tyranny of accounts books everywhere, which is good though, actually, because we can see what's going on. So yeah, a lot, and many Scots, they would work their indenture and then buy an enslaved person themselves or whatever and rent them out. So there's a lot of that going on, renting out, and then build up fortune by a plantation and get rich in a way, on the pioneer stuff on the frontier that you couldn't have done back home in Scotland. Why the Scots? I mean, the Scots piled in. I think Scotland was a very poor country before the Act of Union, and then the rebellion in 1745. So a lot of Scots, it's after that Civil War, looking for advantage. They're economic migrants really, but with an amazing advantage, which is their skin color, which licenses them immediately. But yeah, and the Scots, and it's intriguing in Scotland today. I mean, I'm Scot. I live in Scotland. we have a perception of ourselves as victims of colonialisation.
Yes,
I
I
mean,
was
we
going
go
to
on
ask
about
about
it an
that.
awful lot,
Yeah.
but we were we were colonizers and vicious capitalists like everyone else who had a chance.
So we're on the same page. Carla, you mentioned compensation claims. I mean, this is one of the compromises which the British abolitionists made. It's the deal with the devil, that to sweeten the pill of abolition, slave owners, not the slaves, slave owners would be compensated for their, and I quote, loss of property. And just to be clear again, we're not talking about 50,000 members of the aristocracy and royalty. I mean, sure, there are dukes. There are 3 dukes there in the compensation claims. There are lords. There are members of parliament there. But there are also Church of England clergymen, 120 of them, doctors, lawyers, teachers, bankers, merchants. There are shopkeepers, bakers, farmers, people in the shipping business too, including Royal Navy captains, even carpenters and shipwrights investing in empire to build a nest egg for their kids. And speaking of which, there are thousands of child claimants there as well, orphans mostly, while 2 in 5 claims are from women. And again, just for the record, this is a snapshot. This is a moment in time of the people owning slaves at the point of abolition. You have 200 years of British slave owners to deal with as well. I mean, going back to what we were talking about earlier, Alex, this is all of us. There are nearly 50,000 slave owners who received compensation in the late 1830s at a cost of £20 million to the British Treasury. That was around 40% of the Treasury's annual budget at the time and is the equivalent of 17 billion today. And it took until 2015 for the loan which paid for all of this to be finally settled.
The bill could never have gone through Parliament because with some, rightly, the slave owners who were, owned a lot of MPs and were a huge lobby were going, we legally acquired this property. You can't take it away from us just because you've changed our mind. You need, well, you can, but you're going to have to compensate us. So that is what happened, and it's the biggest single sum of money the British borrowed by the British government in the 19th century. I think it's absolutely huge, and it's kind of interesting that they borrowed it off the Rothschilds and another of the great European banking families. And it's kind of interesting, as people have pointed out, when the Treasury announced in a tweet going, "This is really interesting, but today we managed to pay off you've all played a part in the abolition of enslavement." A lot of black people said, "You mean my taxes have been paying to compensate rich white people for?" They took that tweet down quite quickly.
Yes.
I own I am shocked at the purchase of slaves, and fear those who buy them and sell them are knaves. What I hear of their hardships, their tortures and groans, is almost enough to draw pity from stones. I pity them greatly, but I must be mum. For how could we do without sugar and rum? Especially sugar, so needful we see. What? Give up our desserts? Our coffee and tea?
As William Cowper makes clear in his 1788 poem Pity for Poor Africans, slavery may have been about frippery and luxury, but at root, as it was for James Ferguson in Tobago, it was all about the money. James may have failed to make the sums add up in the end. The Carrick estate made a few £100 a year from its cotton crops, but this was dwarfed by the money poured into it from Scotland. Quite frankly, the Fergusons' Tobago venture was never, from their perspective, a successful one. And so, in 1785, they sell the remaining 79 slaves on the Carrick plantation.
I think one of the things that I'm interested in is that essentially, I mean, particularly the Carrick estate in Tobago doesn't make money. And sort of if you extrapolate this out to the thousands of other plantations there were across the Caribbean, you can see why some people say, well, slavery, it's peanuts. It doesn't really have anything to do with Britain's economic success in the 18th and 19th centuries. For me, that's missing the point, because it's not about each individual slave owner's profit or loss. It's about the money that pours into the exchequer.
Yes. taxes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And it's 11% of GDP by 1800, which gives you an idea of the tax revenue. And then income tax is invented in 1801. And suddenly, so my ancestors, and I've got their accounts from that period, are paying tax on every enslaved person, every barrel of sugar sent home, every they were importing all the bricks and the wood. I mean, everything, and the food was all coming from Britain because it was cheaper to have that imported than paying tax and all that. Cheaper than have the slaves work growing their own food. Better to have them growing the sugar in the Jamaica plantation. And then income tax suddenly as well. So I think it's quite hard to work out, but I don't think for the Ferguson family and their co-owners in Jamaica, I think they pay more in tax considerably than they ever made in profits from both the unprofitable Tobago venture, which was a disaster. James died after 4 years, and the French then seized the island, and the very profitable sugar plantation. The British government did really well out of it.
In 1807, the taxes on sugar and other exports from the Caribbean equated to 1 in every £8 paid into the British Treasury. It's by no means a stretch to say that Britain was able to finance the Napoleonic Wars, that's 12 years of fighting on sea and land, in what was essentially one of the first worldwide wars, because of this income from slavery and slave-related activities. Of course, income tax, which was introduced for the first time specifically to prepare Britain for war, was the primary economic driver. But new taxes on raw cotton brought in £10 million, and sugar custom duties a further £34 million over the course of the wars. Now, Alex, I know there's a school of thought nowadays among some economists and historians that we're over-egging the pudding here, that actually slavery wasn't that important to Britain's expansionist programme. Where do you stand on this?
What worries me, some people seem to use that debate, which has really been going on since Williams wrote in the 1940s, as a way of talking about the moral side of it, as though in some way, if it wasn't that important, we don't need to feel that bad about it. I think that's absolute nonsense. What we need to feel bad about is we shipped 3.1 million African people, enslaved them, stole their and all their descendants, took their babies from them, from their arms if we felt like it. We murdered them, and we don't even have a total number for that. We know the number we shipped across the Atlantic. We don't know the total number born. We only know there are about 700,000 people left at abolition.
So that's 3 million to maybe 800,000. That is less than a third. And this is at a time, the 17th to the 19th centuries, when the population of Britain triples. We go up 3 times, they go down 3 times.
Yeah, it's just, so the economics are really interesting and important in telling a true story of the growth of Imperial Britain and our wealth even to this day, but they don't affect the morality.
We want to turn back to your ancestors, Alex, because Tobago wasn't the only Ferguson concern. In fact, the family had invested in Jamaica even before James turned up in Tobago in 1773. Can you tell us a bit about the Roselle plantation?
Yes, so the Roselle plantation is much less speculative. I mean, it was been in existence for about 100 years in St. Thomas Parish in the east of Jamaica, near Morant Bay, which Jamaicans will know. And it had another Ayrshire family, the Hamiltons, had made a fortune out of it. And basically most of them were selling up, going home, which they did, and built a nice house, which still exists in Ayr, called Roselle. And it was just a standard, get the money out, partly to avoid some forms of taxation as well. But so they just sold on to their Ayrshire neighbours, my mother's family, the Fergusons, and the Hunter Blairs, who were a banking family, very deep into lending money to the slave economy, which is a crucial part of it, obviously. But neighbours, same Scottish gentry, landed gentry types, and so Roselle was bought as a going concern with 180 enslaved Africans already on it, and I've been there, unlike any other members of my family, but and it's good land running up from the sea. And so they basically took a going concern and started running it, and that went increasingally well as the rest of the 18th century paid out with a regular income. I mean, the details of running it are fascinating, and because my great uncle 6 times was a absolute maniac. He wanted every detail. He writes letters, takes 6 months to arrive, going, "What do you mean another mule has died?" But he kind of the mule, but then the next one go, "What do you mean one of the Africans?" And he doesn't use that word. Has fallen into the slurry pit and drowned. But and you get the sense that the mule and the mule probably cost half as much as the African, but they're much of a muchness. But he's a grumpy absentee landlord with his talking to his Scottish hirelings, who about 10 of them who were working on the plantation, are all again Ayrshire, white men from Ayrshire. And what's there's amazingly immaculate, but I mean the British printers printed a book for slave plantation accountants to use. A lot of it
specific has, book for that?
It is laid out in printed. The pages are printed, so you can put deaths, profits, births, and goods shipped, and so on. I mean, it's so regularized. I mean, the whole business of notaries and accountancy is beginning to become a profession, and so the stark details are there, and what you see is a shockingly high death rate just in an average year. There's a year when flu hits and 20% of the enslaved die. And then you also see an echo from public events. So my ancestor was sitting in Parliament, as were many other slave owners, when William Wilberforce, every British school kid of my age knows these dates, 1792, introduced the first act to abolish the slave trade, not slavery. It's often confused, but the trade in Africans, because this is the thing that British liberals were beginning to say. Too many stories were coming back about half-dead people being thrown off the boat to get the insurance money and so on. They were true. And so my ancestor, then MP for Edinburgh, literally walks out of the debate in the Commons on the first bill and writes to the manager in Jamaica saying, we've just been discussing Mr. Wilberforce's bill. It won't pass this time, but certainly it will in the future. Get down to the docks as soon as you can and buy as many young women as you can. And he's aiming to get an advantage of being ahead of this news from the others. So before the price of young women gets up, he gets some teenagers who they can breed more slaves with.
So that
because the importations of enslaved is going to be stopped, which it is in 1807.
So it is specifically to buy women so that you can breed. Oh man!
He specifies as young women, and he does, and we've got their names, and they were all under 20, and we've got their made up names, not their real names, their African names. Yeah, I mean, it's a human breeding ranch and a slave. I mean, I can't believe I'm even saying those words, but it's a breeding ranch for humans and a sugar production estate. And both are profitable enterprises.
In the 65 years between the Fergusons taking over ownership of Rozelle in 1769 and the abolition of slavery in 1834, the estate saw its economic fortunes rise and fall, but of course the most important fortune was the human one. 3 generations of enslaved people whose lives were ruined and blighted. Alex, I know that you give a tally of just some of the hundreds who died during the tenure of Adam Ferguson, and it is a list of names in your book, pages long, which can make you weep. But are you able to paint a picture of the number of enslaved people, the sheer sort of quantity of humanity who might have passed through Rozelle over those 65 years?
Yes, I tried to do, because there are full accounts for some years, none for others. So I tried to do averages and see the average death rate, which we said could vary between 5 and 20%. And the birth rate, which is always very low. And I think I came up with about 950.
950
people had lived there at one point or another. And at abolition, where already the sugar prices were down, there is an argument that abolition partly came because it just wasn't producing what it used to do, the whole Caribbean sugar economy. But at abolition, very cynically, it's no longer Sir Adam, but the Hunter Blairs and Sir Adam's nephew, my great grandfather, bought 200 more very superannuated, very elderly enslaved people, put them on the plantation to get more compensation, because compensation was paid per head.
Okay.
And you can kind of see that in the records as well. I mean, it was literally, they went around the islands and said, okay, a man is worth £12 and a child is worth 5 and the old person's worth 2, that sort of thing. And that's how the 20 million was calculated.
In 1836, the Fergusons and their co-owners at Brazil received £3,591 in compensation for 198 enslaved people. That's a little over 3 million today. And it's important to remember that this is just a snapshot, the value of slaves owned at the point at which the practice ended. The Roselle estate was finally sold in 1875, after more than a century of ownership. It went for just 6% of its 1790s value. The next voice you're going to hear is that of the Guyanese poet Maggie Harris, reading specially for Trapped History, her poem titled I Come From.
I come from borrowed names, given names, names of dispossession. Hawker, Harris, Princess Margaret waving her white-gloved hands from the motor cavalcade. I come from faces, earth and sun faces, tamarind faces, watermelon teeth. From hands, rough carpenter's hands, smooth Nivea-creamed hands, blue-veined and cutexed, hands that reached for the cane. I come from skin and bone, Portuguese skin, African bones buried in forgotten oceans. From the ringing of bells, the clapping of hands, from 4-day morning drums over a Pentecostal backyard, from cutlasses and ships, from red bauxite pyramids of barges, from that name, Captain. Cutting through those rivers they charted, navigated, christened, home.
It's a very powerful poem.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember it's interesting because I talked to a lot of people. I mean, the best part of researching this book was going to Tobago and Jamaica and talking to people living still on that land who might be descendants, and saying like, "Here I am. What does it mean? What do you think people like me should do now?" And people were obviously lovely and incredibly generous and interested and hospitable.
I was interested, how do those conversations with the people in the Caribbean go? Like the family histories for the slavery, but from the other side of the story, like Sherman Edwards, Junior Thomas, Leonard Kwashi. I mean, what reaction is anyone going to get when they effectively say, "My people enslaved your people"? Did you expect the reaction that you got in those conversations?
I don't know what I expected. I do write about this a bit in the book. I mean, I kind of turned up feeling a bit of a pond man, really, and I sort of Junior, who's a lovely man, who's a local guide in Tobago, and who basically takes people out to see hummingbirds. And I just found him in this Bloody Bay. Bloody Bay is the name of where the plantation was, and sort of run-down village in this sort of non-beach end of Tobago. And we had a really interesting time wandering around, and we found the gun that my ancestor, it was an amazing moment that my Aunt James writes about, that he borrowed off the army and put on the headland to deter American pirates. It's the beginning of the American Civil War, from raiding the plantation, which they'd done. And we literally found it in the jungle. And Junior and Edward Crushy helped me find it. And putting my hand on the gun, I knew my ancestor's hand had rested. That made it suddenly real. And eventually I had to fess up and say why I was there, because they were I could see them going, "You know an awful lot about this place for a tourist," and I said, and we went and had a conversation, then we went and had a few beers and another conversation, and they were very well, good that you're here. That was then, this is now. And I said, what would you think, what apology, with money, what do you think people like me, or the nations still rich, should do? And they went, apology first. And you realize, because people in Britain go, "Oh, what's the point of apologizing? Nobody wants an apology." And you go, no, people do want an apology. I mean, I think there are South Africans who would like an apology for apartheid.
Yeah.
And in a sense, in Truth and Reconciliation Commission that you talked about, you did get somewhere towards that. But, Britain won't apologise. Very regrettable. An apology is deep in the repair healing process, I think. We do know this,
What's your relationship like now with the island and the Caribbean? Like, what do you feel some sort of kinship with it, or what's the
do you know the main? So I talk to lots of people there. I have lots of conversations because the book, people get in touch, and I, if me and some other members of the family try and fund a few charitable enterprises that look good, particularly for youth. And I feel I've never been back. I haven't been invited back. I haven't had a reason to go back. There was nearly a TV documentary made, and it wasn't. But I feel quite horrified, actually. A friend rang me up a couple of years ago and said, "Oh, we're going on holiday to Tobago. Got any tips?" And I went, "It's soaked in blood." I mean, literally, it's soaked in blood, spilt because of greed. I don't see how you could go and lie on the beach. But it is, I mean, some things people said stuck with me, and one of them, going back to Maggie's poem, is the sense. Someone said to me, "So what your ancestors did on that day in December, 1801. All I know about mine, and I know it for absolute certain, is that they were living in horror and misery, unable without any safety at the, and they knew the same would happen for their children as it had been for their parents. That's all I know. I don't even know their names, and it seems like an incredible theft. And the fact that today we still compound that theft with saying this history is not important or should be forgotten or get over it, it seems really terrible. The other very moving thing that I don't think it is in the book, but someone did say to me on one of those plantations, was, "Did you do anything good with the money?" Which kind of made me want to weep as you go. The Hunter Blairs wrote this, built this stupid palace in the style of a French Loire Valley chateau. But we didn't do anything good with the money that justified the horror.
The thing about you finding that canon, it's big, isn't it? It's
I think there's a photo in the book.
There's definitely a photo in the book.
That's massive. It's £40 or something. It's huge.
And you put your hands on it, as you say. You can feel a relative, my great whatever, would have put his hands on this.
Yeah.
Does that help? Does that give any sense of closure, or does it?
No, I don't think there's any closure to be had. No, it helped because I was kind of wandering around there in a daze, kind of running out of money, because I only had a pretty fixed budget. And I've been there 2 weeks already, going, at what point am I going to? So I think this bit of land is where he built his house, which he describes building it with the help. And describes the wood he built it with, and he ordered green painted chairs from England to be sent out. But there's all this wonderful detail. This is the bit where he must have stood where he said, with binoculars, I can see everything that's going on the plantation. But I couldn't feel him. And then I saw the gun. So I think just as a writer, I wanted to feel this connection. But I realized that the core to this whole thing was that realizing that I couldn't go, these were monsters for another age. They were actually like me. And given the circumstances, if it had been me and family that ordered me to do it, and I might have done the same thing. I couldn't honestly say I wouldn't. And that seems to be really important, because making the white slavers into monsters, which they undoubtedly did monstrous things, but that is othering, and it's not really useful. It's better to understand them as humans, like Nazi concentration camp guards, who can do terrible things, and that's how we guard against this happening again. See them as humans, not people from another era.
So, Alex, where do we go from here? It feels like maybe you've made peace with this family history in a way, but is that it? All kind of done, dusted, nothing to see here? Or is there more? And I'm using this word deliberately. Is there more we can do?
I think there's a huge amount more. I mean, and very much, I'm we're guided by the descendants of the enslaved on this, and have been, I hope. I mean, and people said to me, you asked me, what I was in the Caribbean, and I mean, apology is good is a really important line. So I've done quite a bit since the book was published with other people who've acknowledged their own family history in the same area, and as you said, Oswin, there are an awful lot of them. I mean, many millions descendants. To say it's good to come out and acknowledge it and talk about it, and it's good to lend your voice to anti-racism and to calls for repair in some form or other. But and we formed a little lobby group, a little sort of educational group called Heirs of Slavery, controversially because the names have annoyed everybody, but they do grab attention. But and I'm a journalist, and so we do that kind of lobbying work, educational work, but primarily people get in touch and go, "Ooh, I found this traces of this, and might be doing a bit of research in my family, and what should I do?" and so on, and help them come forward. And that's really about saying, why don't you ask your black neighbour what they think and start this conversation? Could be tricky, but actually, if you're serious about being uncomfortable with it, then you need to share it and talk about it. And that's been, I think, really fruitful in many ways. And it paves into a much wider thing about, which is the CARICOM nations call for compensation money and a whole load of other things, health aid and technology sharing and debt forgiveness and so on. But of course, the anti-reparations newspapers just say, "Oh, they want to take all our billions." And I think that's a serious discussion that all of Britain, starting with the royal family, need to have and can have, and it will be healthy to have, because if we want to live at peace as a nation going forward, any sort of peace, we need to sort out or attempt to begin to sort out this history and all colonial history. So that's really satisfying. And if anyone is interested, heirsofslavery.org, have a look, there's a contact form on that to get in touch, and we have workshops and newsletters and so on. But for me, the main thing is I'm trying to address that white establishment person, and that's mainly by trying to listen a bit more and learn a bit more and stop telling people what to think. But I've learned so much more since I wrote the book than before I wrote it, I think.
In terms of reparations, you've talked of it as a discussion or as a dialogue. It seems at the moment that it's a monologue. It is Caribbean countries and people from enslaved backgrounds talking about it, but no one engaging with it from the white British establishment.
totally. And we're outliers because the French are engaging with it and the Dutch have engaged with it. The Dutch have already paid us some. Dutch government have paid us some and made an apology. It's 200 million, I think. And the French are in discussions, as they should be, over Haiti. It was a very particular special case. And it, it's just absurd we're not joining. CARICOM nations made a governmental level as a nation grew request 14 years ago to just start a dialogue. And very sadly, this Labour government, who we thought probably would back it, because David Lammy, who became Foreign Secretary, was a big supporter of reparations. He had roots in the Caribbean himself, and he completely reversed on it and said they wouldn't even talk about it. And of course, it's thorny, but it has worked elsewhere. I mean, this needs to be some realism on everyone's sides. I mean, this country is increasingly impoverished, and but it's for us with this background, we heirs of slavery, we support what the descendants of the enslaved want and ask and lend our alliance if that's wanted. And I don't think we could possibly do anything otherwise, given the history. So it's never over. You can't, this was a genocide. It was a crime against humanity that has not been accounted for or even apologized for.
If you'd known then what you know now, would you have written this book?
Oh, 100 times. It's been such a privilege. I mean, I made not a penny from it because I gave my advance away. Just literally, I go to book festival events and people go, "Well, you're just profiting from slavery again," and I go, "No, I'm not. I gave the money away." So, but it's it's completely opened my mind. I mean, I've met so many brilliant people, and heard so many views, and I've heard some really difficult things. I'm still trying to learn and listen. I'm still a privileged white man with a high sense of my own, with a persecution complex and a high sense of my fragility, and I'm trying to deal with those things. But the generosity of the descendants of the enslaved to me has been just wonderful. The hatred from the descendants of the enslavers, particularly in the media, has been astonishing. That anger. It's not just that people go, "Oh, you're just knocking Britain, you'll hate our history." They're really angry. They're really angry. They want to kill you. There are death threats. I mean, David Olusoga gets death threats, but it's I think me as a betrayer of I've been called my class traitor, which is kind of, I want to have it put on a t-shirt. It's a great line. And there's a rage there which is all to do with the decline of Britain, I think, and trying to claw way back to some mythical past when we were the best in every way. There's a lovely man who helped me a lot called Sir Jeff Palmer, who's Scotland's first black professor, and he's a Windrush generation migrant here from Jamaica, and he's really helpful, introduced me to people from Jamaica, and really encouraging on this project. He's a great fighter, anti-racist. He died sadly in 25, and Jeff said, he said, you can't change the history, but you can still change the consequences. And that's a great thought. It's not too late to do something to make the legacies, the outcomes, the ongoing racism, to tackle that. It's not dead history.
You've been listening to Trapped History, written and presented by Oswin Baker and Carla O'Shaughnessy. Our engineer is MK Lee, and the Trapped History theme is by Pavlo Buterin. You've also heard the voices of Rob Sharp, Simon Jackson, and Maggie Harris. If you've enjoyed this episode of Trapped History, do please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to stuff, and please give us a review. It really helps. You can sign up for our free newsletter at trappedhistory.com, where you will also find our extensive archive, bonus episodes, and of course, the Trapped History Hall of Fame. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.